I have made a lot of mistakes in my life. And I want to talk about one of them. It's how I ended up giving my life over to this terrible, terrible project of critical violence studies. And I've been reflecting a lot on the why behind that. And one of the things that comes up is the kind of memory of being really disappointed when I arrived at university. And it surprised me. I don't think I get disappointed a lot because I'm a pessimist. So I'm always like, I set the bar low and like, oh, let's see how this is going to go. But I had an idea of university. I had a utopic vision of the space where people were going to be thoughtful and literate and engaged in thinking deeply about the questions in the world around them. And I guess the context for that is that I grew up in what was then PE in the sort of late days of apartheid. So it was kind of, I was surrounded by the rank and file of the AWB. That is kind of who my neighbors were, my people at my school were. And so I was like, wow, I do believe there's a better world than this some way. And so I thought, well, maybe it's at university. And I got there, and I was just like, what the hell is this? This is nonsense. I don't know what it's for. Like, I do not know this curriculum that I'm being given, that I'm being told to study, that I'm being examined on. I profoundly do not know what it is for. And the weird thing is I couldn't raise that question because that was a question that was not built into the system. The what for question, what wasn't built into the system. It seemed like there was a sense that, like, what do you mean what for? It's what is done. And that was the end of the story. Certain things are done. They are done, and so we carry on doing them so that they stay being done into the future. And I don't know if I was having some kind of delayed adolescent rebellious drama or something, but I couldn't buy that. I absolutely couldn't buy that. And I had this kind of feeling. It's interesting growing up and learning that most adults are not smart. I had my suspicions as a kid, but I didn't think the situation was this dire. And this is the kind of, like, emotional kind of predisposition I had, which, as I sort of transitioned into kind of postgrad studies, which got a lot better, and then teaching, the first thing I wanted to do was answer on a kind of a deep existential level the question, well, what is this for? What is worth knowing? And it seemed to me that the things that were worth knowing were the things that were about making the very bad things that were in the world less bad. It seemed that those things were first of all worth knowing. I think there were other things that were worth knowing, which is like what are the many beautiful things in the world? And I studied literature because I thought that was an important question. That didn't work out either. But the question of like what is worth fixing? And it seemed to me in South Africa there were a number of key problems that are worth fixing. Problems of inequality, problems of poverty, problems of general social suffering. And one of those problems, I guess I started calling the problem of violence. I think that's now a mistake. I think that's the wrong word, because I'm no longer convinced that I'm interested in violence, and I want to talk to you about why I'm no longer sure that I'm interested in it. But there were people who I thought were interesting. I was reading all the wrong people. Instead of reading the stuff for my courses, I was reading like other stuff. So I was reading like the phenomenon books and all of that stuff. And it seemed to me like there's a whole nother epistemology and mode of being human going on there that I had been denied. And And looking at this bell hooks quote, I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around me and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory a location for healing. And I think that's why I'm here today, is that I had a bell hooks moment between thinking like this is rubbish and there is no point to it, and thinking, but there's another epistemological possibility that could take place within the space of the university, and that I wanted to be part of the manifestation of that possibility. And so what I started doing is developing totally new areas that hadn't been offered before. And essentially these two areas, the first kind of emerging areas, there's a third one I'm not going to talk about today, was a kind of an area of violence studies, and the other area was the area of trauma studies, which are kind of the two sides of the same coin. And the interesting thing about the question of violence studies is it is already everywhere. That you can look in almost any discipline and there's a kind of a violence story going on somewhere. But in the same way that it's everywhere, it's also nowhere. And I don't know of really very many places in the world where there is an actual critical violence studies focus that is recognized as a kind of established curriculum. And so this raises a fairly deep question. It's like, well, what is this thing? If it's motivated by a kind of an idea of repair, an idea of fixing the world in a certain way through thought, then what are the questions we're going to ask? Because it seems to me there's a couple of technical questions that are already well asked within several academic fields. And those are questions like, what is the prevalence of violence? What are the causes of violence? What are the solutions to violence? I think those are all really important questions, and I welcome all the work being done on them. But that was not the question that was interesting to me. And I wasn't sure what the question was that was interesting to me. So it's been a process to kind of work this out. But asking those three questions raises the fourth question. Oh, wait, we haven't got that. Or we haven't got the slide I want. Okay. So the prevalence, causes, and solutions. It raises the question of, well, where should violence studies be? Like literally, what field is it in? What discipline is it in? And that seems to be a real problem because it doesn't seem to be located anywhere. But it also means that those three questions kind of erase another question, which is the question that I've ended up thinking about more and more. But isn't the question I started intending to think about more and more, which is the question of, well, what is violence? Like, what is this word referring to? And when we use the word, what work is that word doing in our thinking? So one of the things that I started being interesting is the way in which this idea was distributed amongst kind of traditions and disciplines, and that there's one and that there's several different kind of big groupings. Like there's a criminological idea of violence, which I think is a kind of a big imagined way of thinking about violence in South Africa. So it's actually not about violence; it's about crime. And the notion of violence is subordinated to the notion of crime. And some of you might be aware of that paper, Violence is Not a Crime, where I kind of run at that thing with a knife. So this is about, catching crooks and punishing them to make ourselves safer. That isn't my project. Then there's a kind of various sociologies of crime. The one is a kind of sociology of deviance. Why do people do things that other people don't do? And that's also a kind of a project of like normalization, a problem, how to get people to behave themselves in the world. And that actually isn't my project either. There's a much more interesting set of questions that are raised within kind of sociological frame, which is like what are the kind of systems within which the problems of violence emerge? Like, what are the systems of kind of inequality, distributions of power? And I think those are really interesting starting points for the question of violence. But I have never done a sociology course in my life, so I was a bit on the back foot with this. What I'd done instead is I'd made the mistake of studying psychology. And psychology doesn't talk about violence; it talks about human aggression. Okay, which is an interesting kind of epistemological framing, because to speak of aggression is to locate it as a kind of a drive within an individual, and a thing that a kind of acting of something of one person to another person, and there's a whole nice spread of accounts of that kind of personality theories, neurological accounts, like developmental accounts, the kind of trauma-related accounts, which are the ones that I am far more seduced by than the earlier ones. So we've got all of this stuff going on, and I'm looking at this, and I'm like, well, there's a lot of really interesting tools there, but it's still not. It's not only not answering the question that I want to answer, it's not even asking the question that I want to ask. And the difficulty in formulating the question seems to be really interesting to me. Now, there's one way of formulating it, which is to formulate it historically. And in one sense, that's where it was formulated for me. Is like, why is South Africa such a violent society? Why is this place at this point in time? Because at least that locates it within in an actual context, and within the actual context that I was living in. So we can therefore formulate then a bunch of questions, which is, why did it become violent? And I think this is such an interesting question, because this is one of the most highly ideologically contested questions. Is why it became violent, and related to that is when it became violent. And then the question is, well, why does it continue to be violent? And I think those are really interesting. The question is, why does it continue to be? For me, as a kind of at that point anti-apartheid, pro-democracy kind of activist, there was this wildly optimistic assumption on the left that if we got rid of the apartheid state and had a constitutional democracy, that violence would evaporate into the air. It would just stop being a social problem, because we would have human rights that would be constitutionally protected. We'd work towards equality, democracy, and violence would, simply being a kind of epiphenomenon of those problems, it would necessarily just go away if we got society right, if we got democracy and human rights right. I think it's safe to call that now and say we were wrong, that didn't happen. And that means we can ask the question, well, why didn't that happen? And it's interesting, there are various versions of this. I mean, one of the versions of this is like, why did the transition not work in certain ways? And what's replaced that is well, not what's replaced that, but what seems to have existed through all of that is these kind of popular theories. And this is one of the things I'm really interested in. What do people think? And why do and it's not just like, what do people think? Why do people think so much stuff that is so obviously not true? This seems to me a deeper and deeper question that I'm digging myself into. Why do people really like believing untrue stuff? And so there are these popular theories of violence, and so there's the kind of morality and authority kind of philosophy of violence, which is like, kids don't respect their parents these days. They don't respect school teachers. There's no authority. We need to bring back traditional values. And there's this kind of theory of violence that and this kind of theory of violence has also really become a kind of cornerstone of Trumpism and many emergent kind of Western fascist societies. We need to return to traditional authority and get things back the way they were before all this nonsense started. And that's an interesting belief, which I'll talk about, the idea of the nonsense having started quite recently. There's another kind of a theory, and it's interesting because this theory gets kind of proposed amongst otherwise quite opposing social groups. Is a kind of an idea of state failure. Is that the state, and it's a version of the authority theory, that the state does not command respect and has become kind of soft. And what we need to do to solve the problem of violence is by doing stuff like bringing back corporal punishment in schools, bringing back the death penalty, giving the police the right to shoot citizens on sight. And I guess for me, I in my head, this is flagged as the Becky-Taylor theory of nonviolence. Okay, but what's interesting about all of these beliefs, which is what troubles me about popular theories of violence, common sense theories of violence, is they all at a certain point seem to come to the same conclusion. And this is the conclusion where I part company, is that the solution to the problem of violence is more violence. Okay? The solution to people being mugged is people being incarcerated under the most horrific punitive conditions being possible. The problem of murder needs to be solved by hanging people. And so this is not an anti-violence theory. This is that theory of violence is in fact a pro-violence theory, which I don't think we've problematized enough. And its foundational commitment is a commitment to violence. It's just a commitment to the violence of social control versus the violence of social disorder. And I think that much of the contestation of violence is it's not about is violence good or bad. It's like is the violence of control better than the violence of disruption? And for me, that is as problematic as aversion can be for a whole lot of reasons. So instead, what I started trying to do then is to develop both a curriculum and a process. And this is what has been interesting about my implementation of violence studies, is that some of it is the development of a curriculum, like a set of readings, a set of theories to cover, a set of discussions to have in tutorials. And some of it is completely process-oriented. And that seems to be something that I didn't kind of conceptualize in advance. That's the kind of thing that I discovered in action is process-oriented teaching and learning. So instead of saying, well, what are the academic theories of violence in sociology, psychology, wherever, it's saying instead, how do people understand it? Okay, how do they imagine? How do they think about what it is, what causes it, and what can fix it? Like, what is already in people's minds at the level of common sense? That, if you discipline your children, then we will have a less violent society. Those kinds of things, the things that are they just seem true, and they are just already there in common sense. And to ask the question, well, what are people understanding at that level, and why are they understanding it in those kinds of ways? Okay, and all of that is just to ask the third question, which is the question of consequences. What are the consequences of these lay understandings, these popular, commonsensical understandings, and do they actually move us forward, or don't they? And that's a question that once you formulate it like that, it becomes much more of a kind of a testable question and an examinable question. But it means you've got to start focusing on things that have been left out, which is firstly the question of how are ideas of violence created and transmitted, and the question of what if we are wrong. And so I realized that part of what I wanted to do is, instead of teaching students the Western canon of theories of violence, I wanted to say, how can you work out what you think? This is a really interesting and difficult question. Like, how do you know what you already believe? And it turns out that's really hard. Like, people believe a lot of stuff that it just functions as obviously true. And it's this category of the obviously true has been interesting me more and more. Like, what's already there? What's already there about, like, well, if we just kind to everyone, then everything will be okay. If we just throw people in jail, then everything will be okay. Like, what are these ideas? How are they existing? But also, how can we recognize them? Because this seems to be one of the founding questions of this project, is the insight that everyone already has a theory of violence. You don't have to learn sociology, psychology, criminology, or anything. Every single person has a theory of violence that functions at the level of invisible common sense, and that motivates them to do certain things. It motivates them to vote for certain political parties, to call for certain law enforcement policies, that makes them want to practice certain kinds of community interactions, that makes them make statements about foreigners or trans kids or whatever. That there's an underlying common sense that manifests as all of those different things. But that common sense operates below the level of awareness. And so it seems to me that the pedagogical project that I'm interested in is, how do you bring that to the level of awareness? How do you make unconscious common sense something that is lifted into the domain of actual critical reflection, so that you can assess it? And this actually turns out to be the real project of this critical violence studies teaching, not the sort of covering of theories. So there's a couple of phases that I would identify in this project. And the first is a kind of reality check, is to test things that people believe against things that people that can be verified in research. Because there's a whole lot of stuff that people believe. Like, people believe, I mean, everyone all the time believes that violence is getting worse. Who of you believe that violence is not getting worse and hasn't been getting worse?
I do.
Okay, but you're academic. It's really interesting.
Like, really?
That's immediate disqualifying. This is one of the most powerfully held beliefs. And what's interesting is you can track it back to the earliest written records we have. You can track it back to Plato, this belief that violence is getting worse. You can track it back through every period of recorded history that we have. There are two complaints. Violence is getting worse, and children are not respecting their parents anymore. These are as close as I know to cultural universals. Like, this is just a lament through history. And what's interesting, for instance, at the point where I was formulating this, it was really interesting, because it was that point between 1994 and 2011, and people were freaking out, like, oh my God, like the country's going to hell, there's so much violence, people getting stabbed, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, here are the numbers, okay? South Africa was going through one of the most radical declines in criminal violence that is known. I mean, there was literally murder rate dropping from like 25,000 to 13,000. I mean, this is a dramatic, successful social project that was unfolding, and no one believed it. And like, when I'd show people the data, they would simply deny the data. They would say, that's bullshit, the police are cooking the books. And it's like, actually they're not. This is like, things like homicide rates. These are really, really good, hard empirical data. And And this is kind of at the heart of the process of saying, well, people have a sense of reality that doesn't correspond to reality. And that dissonance, it seems to be the gateway. That's the door that I want to open. It's like, okay, let's open that gap between what people think and what is demonstrably true. And this applies to everything else, like the death penalty. Like 80% of South Africans believe the country would be safer if we brought back the death penalty. People who study the death penalty, do empirical studies on it, almost, not absolutely universally, but almost universally, do not believe that and show that to be false, apart from the human rights objection to it. But what's interesting is this tension between the kind of experts and popular beliefs. And this is all, I mean, the United States is a really interesting example of a society that's gone into a state of catastrophe because of the rupture between experts and popular beliefs, that democracy is actually breaking down in real time because that rupture has become so enormous now. So opening up that gap and thinking about thinking about what it means that there's that kind of tension, and then also raising, in opening up that gap, then identifying what are the fantasies that constitute common sense, okay? And this is where what do people mean when they talk about violence? And one of the first things I do when I walk into the class is I say, okay, everyone write down 3 examples of something that is violent, 3 examples of something that is not violent, and 3 examples of something where you're not sure. And that's really hard, where like someone else, you can imagine someone else saying that is violent, and you can imagine yourself disagreeing with them. Because the fantasy version of violence is the street. It's a kind of the street crime version. It's like getting mugged, getting hijacked, housebreaking, and the fantasy of kind of stranger danger sexual violence, of being sexually assaulted by a person you don't know in a kind of dark alley somewhere. And what's interesting about these is that these become then the object of politics, they become the object of law enforcement policy. But when you look at them, they're not the preeminent forms of harm that people are at risk of. And so it seems there's something of a gap between forms of harm and conceptualizations of risks of violence. And that gap seems to be really interesting to me. For instance, one of the key things we know is that violence happens primarily between people who know each other, not between strangers. It doesn't primarily happen as a method of committing property crime. It happens primarily as a means of negotiating interpersonal kind of interactions. So people getting into fights like people kill each other getting into fights much more than they kill each other getting into like altercations around like a hijacking or mugging and stuff like that. But the fantasy is that it's these property-related crimes, and the fantasy behind that is that there's a category of violent person that fits in with the fantasy of a criminal. Okay, there are criminal people in society who are fundamentally different from the nice, good, law-abiding people, and that the problem of violence is the problem of what to do about these criminal figures. Now, it's not that criminality doesn't exist. It's the fantasy that is the domain of violence, that is the extent of violence, and solving that problem solves the underlying problem. That's the thing that is fundamentally problematic. And what starts happening when we start exploring that is that in fact it takes many more and broader forms than the ones that are articulated within the kind of moral panics in the media, the political sloganeering, and the anxiety that people form. And instead, what I've been interested in pushing towards is to really break down this moral dichotomy between perpetrators and victims, and what happens to our thinking if we let go of that moral dichotomy and start thinking about violence differently. For instance, firstly, thinking about perpetrators as also in another way being victims, and secondly, and to me this is actually a much more important project, is to stop thinking about ourselves as being the good guys, to stop thinking about ourselves as being kind of somehow ontologically different from the people who are doing violence. There are bad people doing violence, and there are normal/good people like ourselves who are not doing violence. And it seems that that is one of the things I want to start taking apart. And what becomes interesting then is we start moving into entirely different meanings of the word. We start expanding our concepts from the kind of like the popular notion of street crime as violence to broader, more structural notions of violence. So the question is, I mean, for me, how do we talk about the violence in that image? Is there any violence in that image, it seems to me? Because it seems at the beginning of the course, most people would say, no, there's no visible violence happening there. I'm assuming most of you have now transformed yourselves into a critical, analytic universe where you would tend to answer that yes in the way that exactly the way the first year would answer it no. Am I right? Who's going for a yes on that? Yes, there's violence in that image. And who's going for a I can't see anything that I would want to call violence there. And that's a kind of question, okay? And so there's a lot of really powerful conceptual tools that we can start using at that point to say, well, we need to frame this thing differently, and we need to frame it more inclusively. And I think that's one of the key words that kind of guides this project is not only is it a critical exploration of violence, it's also an attempt to have an inclusive exploration of violence. So the ideas of symbolic and epistemic violence, for instance, talking about not the physical acts that happen to people, but the way in which structures of thought actually harm people and create social harms, which is a kind of a big these are very big forms of harms, which I think fortunately we're starting to really debate and recognize in depth now. Also, the notion of slow violence, which I think is an interesting one, which is developed to move us away from the idea of like an assault, like this momentary, very intense, like getting stabbed, whatever, and to say there are kinds of violence that happen at a subliminal level, where they don't get noticed on a particular day or a particular minute in a particular day, but they're there all the time carrying on. And because of that, they're in danger of being made invisible. And finally, perhaps the biggest kind of overarching notion that we start exploring there is the notion of structural violence, the kind of violence that doesn't need an offender. And that part of it seems to be really interesting. That firstly, it doesn't need to be physical. Structural violence can be physical or not physical. And when people talk about structural violence, they're talking about the kind of harms that happen to people. So for instance, we've got any epidemiologists here? How many kids die of malnutrition-related causes every year? Do you know?
I don't know.
Last I knew it was about 50,000.
A lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. Whereas the number of people that get murdered is about 15. Now it's actually gone up into the low 20s. So it's about 20,000. So it's many more times kids die of malnutrition-related diseases than people get murdered. Okay. And yet we put, I think, about 150 billion rand a year into the criminal justice system that's trying to stop the murdering kind of violence. But the kind of violence of like kids not getting food, kids not getting water that is clean so that they don't die of dysentery, that is not framed as a public anxiety the way getting hijacked is. okay? And it's not attended to with the political fervor the way those kind of those forms of violence are. It becomes this kind of slow violence, becomes a structural violence that isn't even called violent. It just becomes the nature of the world, becomes the way things are, becomes naturalized. And so in that sense, it seems to me that this is why I'm not sure that I even want to use the word violence anymore. I think I want to use the word harm now. I think I want to actually just can violence as a red herring that led me off the path. And what I really want to talk about is forms of harm. But it's interesting going in with the talk of violence because it triggers people's imagination in a particular way that harm doesn't. So that leads to what I'm interested in about is where this critical violence studies as an implemented undergraduate course goes, and where it leaves behind the idea of communicating an established knowledge base, an established curriculum, and really starts focusing on a kind of a process of transformation. And I suppose what we could also think of in another language is a prefigurative politics, which is the goal of the course rather than the transmission of social science knowledge, becomes a way of creating people who will live in society in certain kinds of ways, not simply as bearers of expertise, but as people interacting with other people, having values, supporting projects, things like that. And that's where I get really interested in shifting the question of violence from the question of like, who are the criminals? Why are they doing this? How can we stop them? To the question of what am I a perpetrator of? That's not a happy question. It's not a question that people would volunteer for if I told them at the beginning of the course that that's really what I wanted them to think about. Because it's easy to think, well, what am I not a perpetrator of? Like, I don't carjack people, I don't drag people, I don't punch people in the face, I don't usually murder people, even when they make me really cross. So I'm not really a perpetrator of anything. But once we've looked at harms as broad and harms as structural, we start having to ask a whole lot of questions. What am I the perpetrator of when I put petrol in my car? And I think that's a really interesting question. What is the relation between the 1.5 million people that have been murdered in Iraq and engine? Like, what is the connection between those two things? Because there absolutely is a connection. Okay. What am I a perpetrator of when I buy a new pair of shoes? Like, what harms go into a pair of shoes? What harms go in? What animals were tortured? What environmental harms will be irreparable because of those shoes? What the 15-year-olds in what sweatshops were working 12 hours a day to create those shoes? So it seems to me the question of what am I a perpetrator of is a question that becomes like a question of everything. Like a question of like, well, when I put the heater on, what is that doing to climate change, and what is that doing to the next generation that are not yet born? It seems to me that we live in very dense and complex systems of harm, and that the idea of us being the good guys and someone else being the bad guys, it seems that is just analytically unsustainable. That is preposterous. And so we have to reframe the whole kind of thinking about it to say, how can we understand what are the consequences of the ways in which we are human, the ways in which we have ordinary lives, and that those lives have infinite ramifications, infinite ripples into the world beyond us. Okay. And all these ideas, these sense of ourselves, these feelings we have, like can we understand them? Can we know what they are? Can we know where they come from? Can we understand why they are really difficult to change? But mainly, can we understand what effects they have? And I suppose one of the ways that by the end of this of this course, I want students to be able to ask is, what are the effects of living a normal life? As a, I'm not into what are the effects of going and shooting someone. Everyone knows what the effects of that is. But what are the effects of living a normal life? Which consists of a whole lot of other things, like what are the effects of getting jealous when your intimate partner does something? What are the effects of being angry with migrants because economic conditions are hard? What are the what are the effects of saying, well, I really want this political party to get into power because they'll sort things out? And to understand the kind of these radical kind of networks, these dense networks of interconnectedness, and to have a theoretical framework that allows us to look at those networks from the standpoint of what is the harm, what harm is occurring here, and then to frame that in two more positive directions, which is, what are the alternatives to this? Because that's the point of saying, well, we first have to know what it is to say what are the alternatives to it. And the alternatives are not obvious. The alternatives to putting petrol in your car and buying a pair of shoes are not obvious, even to me, having thought about it for decades. And so the question of who do we want to be and what world do we want to create requires much more than a kind of trite moral sense of not doing bad things in the trivial kind of criminal sense, in the trivial kind of sense, well, I don't punch people in the face, and instead to have a much more integrated sense of harm, but not only of ourselves as perpetrators, okay, also of ourselves as victims, and to be able to articulate what we are also victims and survivors of, and to find languages for articulating that. Because one of the ways in which people are harmed is by having the understanding of what is happening to them withheld from them. And that there we loop back to that kind of epistemic violence. That one of the ways in which we are rendered powerless, we are rendered alienated, is because certain understandings are being withheld from us in an organized way. Not just we haven't read that book yet. And in that sense, my initial disappointment with the university when I went there, and I was like, this is rubbish. There's really big stuff happening in the world and no one's talking about it, was this experience of a kind of epistemic violence, of kind of having these professors who wanted to talk about Jane Austen and 19th century England and 1950s American psychological theories. And they, because they couldn't, for some reason, talk about what was actually happening in the streets at that time. There was something inside them that is like, things will spin out of control or get scary, or we don't know what will happen if we actually start talking about reality. And that seems to, that feeling of being disappointed by university seems to be a kind of a feeling of having been on the wrong end of a kind of epistemic violence. And I suppose this development of this analytic framework and the subject is a kind of epistemic revenge. It's a kind of taking back the ability to talk about the fact that things are not well in the world, and that acting as though they are well in the world seems to be the precise condition of possibility of those bad things carrying on happening. That's it.
I love this image.
Thank you so much, Prof. Collins. I think you present such a radical and incredibly unsettling notion of violence, or more specifically, harm as not existing elsewhere. And I think that's something that we have to grapple with, especially in our current geopolitical um, situation that we're currently in, with our looming and ever-present climate crisis. It's always as though violence and this harm exists beyond us, outside of us, that there is an other that we can cast that role onto. But what happens when we look inward? I think that is something radical. Um, and the question that I have surrounding that is, how can that be universally applied, or could it be universally adopted? And that's sort of the question that I'm opening up to everyone maybe in the room, because I do want, I think for this kind of conversation, I would like it to be more interactive and starting more with the audience. But that's sort of the question that I have, is that can we get to the point where that is our universal understanding of harm? So with that, I'm going to open up for Q&A. We have a question in there. Raji?
Yeah, interesting talk, Anthony. Thank you very much. The question that comes to my mind is, what is the unit of analysis that you are trying to get at here? Is the unit of analysis the individual, the community, society, the environment? Because depending on how one defines the unit of analysis, one can kind of try to find answers of who are the perpetrators and who are the so-called victims or survivors. And it seems as if one approaches it in a kind of a linear, sequential, causal way, you get a different set of answers compared to if you think about it in a systemic, ecological way. That violence is not necessarily A causing harm to B, but it's a systemic phenomenon.
That's a lovely question. I'm going to jump to the middle of your question. I don't want to know who the perpetrators are anymore. I have finally let go of that question, and I now regard it as profoundly uninteresting. I don't want to know who the perpetrators are. I'm interested in another question, which is why the perpetrators, who they are. This seems to me anachronistic hangover from a weird, like a moralistic way of thinking about the world, which leads to a punitive way of responding to social harms rather than a transformative way of. So, on the question of what is your unit of analysis, I am. Foucault at one point described himself as a cheerful positivist. And I love that, but I'm neither cheerful nor positivist, and so question of unit of analysis is almost a non-question to me. It's the wrong question, because the A in front of the unit of analysis, I would want to ask a question: what fields of what fields do we want to make intelligible? And asking what fields we want to make intelligible is different from asking what is our unit of analysis. Because it seems to me that to say, is it the individual, is it the community, is it the society, is it the global ecosystem, is to already have implied that those things can be separated into separate independent systems. And that's precisely what I just absolutely not. Like, no ways. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prof. Just a quick note.
Clicker.
Yeah.
Just a quick note, when you do ask a question, just give us your name. I think we had a question. Posito?
Thanks, Anel. My name is Posito Baleni. Thank you so much, Prof. Collins, for such a thought-provoking talk. I really enjoyed it, especially the nuance of harm, how you how you speak about moving away from the concept of violence to harm. I think that's a very important nuance, and it's something that I have also I've been asked a lot because my work is on black violence, black on black anti-black violence in the South Africa, like in South Africa, intrasubjectively and intersubjectively. So I've been asked quite a lot, what do I mean by violence? Do I mean physical violence? And I've been struggling to answer that question because for me, it's atmospheric. It's almost atmospheric. And that is the nuance that I think your term, harm, is more aligned with what I'm trying to convey in my study. And yeah, because, for example, in one of the analogies I make or in my work is that of me interacting with, not really interacting, but me perceiving a black man as being violent without me having had any proper interaction with him. And I think that is because of the unconscious or the subconscious structures that I've come to internalize, right? And in that, I saw myself as a victim and him as a perpetrator. He didn't do anything. He probably didn't even recognize me, but I thought I was his victim. And but then when I take a step back, I do realize that actually I was the perpetrator on the other hand, because I perceived him as being violent without having any sort of contact or interaction with him. So in that case, I was a perpetrator. So yeah, I'm trying to look at that nuance of the atmospheric violence, not rigid violence in physical sense. Or yeah, thank you so much.
I love this term atmospheric. I'm going to steal that from you, because that is it. That the harm is, it's everywhere. It's distributed through everything. It's in the air. And what's interesting, you describe yourself, well, maybe I'm the perpetrator now. No one did anything in that interaction. No one did anything. So you go to your criminologist and they're like, what? What's your question here? No one did anything. Okay, but you're seeing really interesting things going on. You're seeing yourself have a perception and an emotional response, and that response is harming you. It's making you afraid. Okay, so there's a harm that is happening to you in your fearfulness. Okay, and it makes you then not even do anything, just think about a category of people in a certain way, and you're like, wait a minute, I shouldn't be doing that. There's harm in categorizing people in those kinds of ways. We've seen that harm. Okay, and so there are all these elements now, and this is the question. And at that point, what interests me is that the difference between being a victim and a perpetrator is absolutely demolished in your experience, because something happened. That's what interests me. Something happened and it happened because of other things, because there are problems of gender violence, because there is kind of problems of masculine socialization, because gender violence is prioritized over other kinds of violence. Like, people are 100 times more worried about children getting sexually assaulted than children dying of malnutrition. I don't know why. I see it in the world, and I see that, I know why they're worried about children getting sexually assaulted, and I understand that, but I don't know why that's 100 times more important than a child literally dying of hunger. This is not, it's not obvious to me in the way that it's obvious to normal people. But your fear, you didn't just, it's not an aberrant cognition of a short circuit in your brain. It's out of a world. Your fear comes out of a world. At the same time, the construction of black men as dangerous comes out of a world, another incredibly violent world. And so you're like this node in a web that is living an emotional moment because of all of this other stuff. the racist history of construction of the dangerousness of black men, the real problem of gender violence. All of this is happening to you at the level of life.
Every day.
And that's what I want us to be able to talk about. And I think saying, like, well, like, so who are we going to punish for that? Like, that's a preposterous question to me at this point. Like, are we going to say, we're going to make you do rehabilitation training to get your mind right? Well, I guess that's a version of what my course does. But not in a sense of punitive, in a sense of opening a possibility of insightful transformation. And that's what interests me, is that question of insightful transformation.
We have a question in front, Pano.
And then we've got another one on
We have then one in the back and then one.
I have many questions, so I'm trying to formulate one or two for you. So, do you want the good news or the bad news first?
always the bad news.
No, I prefer the good news. So this was a good talk. It was a good talk overall, and I think the question you asked, which I think is more central than the others, because you keep on coming back to it, is really about how to frame violence. How do we frame violence? But in the center of that is the epistemological kinds of questions. So what is violence? How do we get to know violence? So that's an important question, and I couldn't disagree with it. So the others, which then moves me to the not so great news. So I ran a violence unit for 15 years. So all of these things we have actually deliberated on. So structural violence from the Nordic people, we get that term from them. The peace violence, the peace people, you didn't include them right there. The questions about counting bodies after 15 years, this is not helping us at all, really. The question of atmospheric violence, you'll find that term in the book by Mapungube. They use it there as well. That came out on Youth a few years back. But you end up at the more interesting part. I think you really paralyze us, me in one sense. So I ran away precisely because the question of counting bodies, of these units of analysis, is uninteresting, quite partially uninteresting. Not always, because we want to know who dies. So 2 examples. So here's where you get it wrong. Actually, in 1994, the murder rate was 60.01. That was high. And you have a V curve. Yeah. It gets down where you stopped at about 2009, and it starts coming up again. The line is still, the gradient still goes down because right now it's about 43. And we know where it's concentrated, so we know, in Mitchell's Plain, in parts of Athlone, in Dunoon, in Delft, in Tembisa, we know where it is. So in one sense, we have to think about that. But even if we know this, so the question you ask about thinking is an important one. Let me just say. So I think you want to, so when you say violence is not going down, it's not quite true. Because where you started was global is going down, but in certain places it's going up, or it's making these shapes. Take rape as well. Rape numbers were going down from 2008, for instance, if you take that. And then at 2016, 2017, they were 39. Again, the definition of sexual violence is a very tricky one, as you know. So, and they started upticking again. We know this. So even if you count and you just show this, it helps in one moment, but not in others. So here's the thing, and I ask you. If we frame violence symbolically, epistemologically, or structurally, 2 questions. And then the question where you end up, right, which is really interesting. It makes me an individual. Actually, you are psychological in one sense that even if you refuse it, what do you do? Not knowing that violence is atmospheric, it's everywhere, that even if you know the numbers, that you will get a police commissioner in Durban in August last year, make me mad. Says concentration of violence in Durban and Takwini happens in this place. And the people who die are black men. And then before he says this, he had said something. In this neighborhood, there are lots of shebins, unemployment, alcohol, and so on. And then he ends up, he skips forward, he says, we have a problem of black men in South Africa. I'm thinking, you just told us the structural problem of the, and then that they are dying, these men, and they might be killed by other, as you said, by other black men. But how can they be a problem if they're also the victims right there? So even if you say it for 15 years, people, that the problem is a structural one, it's also how you think about violence. You still end up like, look, I cannot do anything here. Let me go and teach students. And then you teach them in a department that teaches them about life as the way in Europe. So you just, your bubble, you can do what you did right there, which is I'm teaching about violence, but really doesn't have any effect in the world. So you paralyze us in a good way, in a bad way as well. What do you say about this, Anthony?
Can I reflect on your question? I would have to take like 20 minutes to reply to your question. Yes, the V, for sure. We know, like, and I often rhetorically, as a trick, say around the time Zuma came into power, violence started escalating dramatically after having dropped for 15 years. It's a really interesting rhetorical way of framing it. But that's all it is. You opened your question with the words, this was a good talk. And my immediate thought was like, wow, that's violent. Isn't that interesting? Like I felt like I took a breath in when you said, this is a good talk. And I'm like, he's going to massacre me now. Like, rhetorical setting up of the praise. Okay, as a like, now, I mean, Kapana's an expert in this area. He's specialized in like practical violence prevention for forever, okay? Now there's just going to be blood on the floor. So isn't that interesting? Okay. I'm going to jump over this. Yes, I think the body counting is really useful, but it's not. It's a useful thing to be able to use as part of systems analysis. You draw two conclusions: that this doesn't let us do anything, and I just disagree with you, and I think that's really interesting. And I watch this happening. I watch this happening to students. Like one of the classic books that I try to use students with is Foucault's Discipline and Punish. Okay, they read that book, and there's two totally different reactions to it. And the one is like despair. They read Discipline and Punish, and they despair, and they're like, power is so complex and like dense and networked, and like we've just got to give up. And I don't feel that. Like I read it and I'm like, I'm so up and full of energy and wanting to go. I'm raring to go after reading it. It's like, this is what I needed to know to start negotiating these problems. So the question of the feeling of whatever it is, the feeling of being rendered powerless, the feeling of being overwhelmed, the feeling of it like it's too everywhere, too complex, the feeling of our agency has dissipated in the density of this analysis. And I understand that feeling. Weirdly, I don't get that feeling. And it do seem to be that some people have that response and other people don't. I haven't yet thought it through it deeply enough to know why. Because certainly the intention is, and for me to be a good teacher, I need to get better at getting people to have the other feeling, getting them to have the energized feeling. And you know that, you've taught students when they get the energized feeling. And they're like, wow, this concept is like, I am going to go and smash down doors with this concept now.
Yeah, that's what I wanted from you. Right there. Stop right there.
Yeah.
The despair, then said, okay, here's the
Okay.
Don't despair, organize.
Well, there's a yes, exactly, exactly. You know, the little fish chasing the big fish. That meme, you know the one. There's a 12-week version of this talk, which is also is like organize. Yeah.
So in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to take one more question. Tema, we're gonna have the conversation during our lunch. Is that fine?
It's okay.
I hope you don't perceive it as harm.
It's
But we'll have the conversation afterwards. But I'm going to take the question in the back. Just introduce yourself. Anyway.
Good afternoon, Prof. My name is Mapiwe. I'm a PhD student here at the center. I really enjoyed your talk. I arrived a bit late, but for the parts I caught, I really enjoyed it. And I'd like to say too, I liked the idea of violence and harm. I think that's a very good shift from the ideas. But my question was related more to this idea of the victim and the perpetrator. Because, for example, Setu now, when she was speaking about her story, she said she felt now she's the perpetrator. And in my work, what I've realized is that some of the young men are victims of, like you said, some sense of harm, whether it be in school, being raised up or whatever, and then they turn perpetrator. So what I've realized is that there's this cycle of this victim-perpetrator dynamic of not knowing if you're a victim or a perpetrator, because even after being a perpetrator, you go on to experience other harms that either affect you to become worse, or for some people create change. So now I wanted to ask how you deal with this dynamic of victim-perpetrator, and I asked specifically because I don't like this term of the cycle of violence. I think I don't know like how to academically break it down yet, but I feel like it takes away the sense of agency that you're caught up in the cycle.
You can do that.
So I wanted to please ask how someone can do it.
That's such a nice question, and it's also a very, very big question. I'm interested in what words do and what concepts do. Like when we use the word criminal, what does that do? When we use the word terrorist, what does that do? Like and in the same way, I'm interested in what is being done when we say perpetrator and victim. And I think those words are as dangerous as words like terrorist, which are used as political strategies of manipulation, not as ways of describing and understanding the world. And so I'm happy to chuck that language now. I think if we just stop, if we said, we put a moratorium on perpetrator and victim until we've thought more deeply about this. And then the question is, what other language, what other metaphors, what other poetics can we come up with? I mean, you notice I sometimes using the language of nodes and networks and things like that, and fields and, like atmospheres, these kinds of things. It seems to me that might be a more useful language because it indicates that we have got complex systems, not simple systems. We're not living in a Hollywood movie where these bad guys come along and then the good guys shoot them and then it's a happy ending. This is nonsensical. We're living in very, very complex systems where everyone is multiple things at the same time. And we need to have a new language for talking about that. Unfortunately, I don't have it in my slide because I haven't worked it out yet. But I think this is. Let me suggest this as a project. Our project is to talk about to talk about harm in a way that is not simplifying anymore. That talks about the complexity of harm. And what if we all work together on a project of articulating the complexity and density of harm?
I would have liked to hear Tema. Is that possible?
Okay, we are over time. So for people who have to leave, if you have commitments, please take the time.
Is that okay?
It's fine. I just want to make sure that people get a chance to leave, and then we'll take Tema.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pressure around. But I think one of the things that it's so beautiful to attend this talk after the ones that we had as students with you, right? Because it leads me to this kind of a very beautiful else way of thinking, right? Because I think one of the things that I enjoyed for me was the provocation of refusing ready-baked ideas of who is the perpetrator and who is the victim, right? Because again, when you look at that language of when parents are saying, "Oh, these children are problematic," right? That paternalistic idea of an assumption a priori of who's the problem is there in academia, where a priori students are lazy, a priori students don't want to work, a priori there's a problem with the student, which justifies a whole host of violences that then follow from there, which justifies belittling students, which justifies a whole host of violence that again is not yet theorized and is not there and it's not spoken about. You know, what happens when a student, there's a very beautiful line that Zandile made the day before yesterday that said, ultimately, take away your money and allow me to write, which is a very beautiful metaphor of sometimes there's a use of power to place students in a particular kind of paternalistic relationship with the academy. You are told that you can come here to ask, but then we'll enact the violence that when you ask, we'll punish you, whether albeit implicitly. You know, so I think one of the things that I enjoyed about that was giving us this language of refusing those ready-made categories, because through that, I think we were able to provoke certain violences that are silent violences, that are assumed, you know, that there's a power that the supervisor has over you. So they have to do that thing, you know, because there's an assumption that you know nothing, you know. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that. So what do you want to, like, phone 10111 and say, I want to report the epistemic violence of my supervisor?
Yes.
And I mean, that's a joke, right? But it's serious that the ways in which we are thinking about what problems to solve are so inadequate to the problems we are living. Sure, when someone pulls a knife on you, you do, like cops, someone help. Okay, but there's so much more than that. There's so much more than that going on. And I forget the words he used. I was so moved by the idea of this, the other space. The other space of understanding that we can start walking towards together, and to really keep the idea of that space open. Yeah. How do we keep it open, and how do we keep walking together? What does that walking involve?
Sure.
In your bio, I was drawn to part that you are worrying about these issues of violence and harm. And I think here at AVRIC, we are worrying with you. And I think the idea of worrying is this thing that it's unending. It's you're grappling with it. It sits with, these are the things that sit with us. And I think that is a very productive space to be in. Especially with the engagement from our students, it is incredibly, I think, energizing to know that you are sitting post-Fees Must Fall with these questions. Being part of the Fees Must Fall graduate generation, I feel really old, but it's so energizing to see that you are sitting with these questions. And then just in closing, you pull apart our transition to democracy, that narrative, that linear narrative that we needed, that idea of symbolic reconciliation. You pull that apart in such eloquent ways, and it is necessary 31 years after the end of apartheid that we sit with these questions and deal with it in a very unnerving way. And I think that is the importance of our conversation today. And I hope that we continue this kinds of conversations here in AVRIC and in the other space and elsewhere in the university. So thank you so much. Please join us for some light